want to introduce Pierre Routier from the CBC. He's a specialist in advanced imaging technologies and has developed innovative solutions and workflows for studios and post facilities in all fields of advanced imaging. UHD, HDR, HFR, and he's currently a media production architect at CBC and our HDR instructor at SMPTE. Please welcome Pierre Routier.
Thank you, and good afternoon. So, it's a very broad subject with only 25 minutes, so I'll try to be concise. The idea here is to talk about and start the thinking process of how we will archive our movies in the future. It's a wonderful year, I feel, 2019, because this summer, at the same time, we've had two good commercial successes, one which was shot in a very traditional way with 35mm film, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and at the same time, we've had an entirely digital production with The Lion King, where the cameras, the models, the set, everything was in a virtual environment. The reason that those movies were a success is not because of the technology, it's because they had a compelling story. So what exactly is a story? Stories have been with human species since the dawn of our history, as much as singing and games and everything else. We find traces of stories in our prehistoric caves. What stories have in common is a couple of elements. First of all, most stories have a subjective point of view. We all know what happened to the Titanic, and everyone knew before the movie came out, but it still grossed more than $1 billion worldwide. Not because it's interesting to know what happened to the Titanic, it's because James Cameron's vision of what happened on that day makes it compelling. So it's that subjective vision of the creative that makes a movie compelling. And also, one of the main characteristics, and this is where I think virtual reality, augmented reality have a little bit of a challenge finding their place in storytelling, is that stories since the dawn of time have always been more of a passive experience. There's someone telling the events and you are receiving them passively. It's not traditionally been an interactive experience. That's more akin to games than it is of stories. So movies are a subset of stories. They're stories that are done in a very specific format. First of all, it's a series of images. It's not fluid motion like in real life. We have 24, 30, 60, or in some instances 120 frames per second, but they're a sequence of images, and that creates certain restrictions on the format and challenges in archiving that we'll talk about later. Normally, once you have picture lock, the duration is predetermined, and when you watch it, it doesn't mean that all the events are going to be chronological, but once you start play, you're going to watch it from beginning to end the way the creatives intended. It's also important to consider that as we're talking about a series of images, we're not talking about 3D models and computer environments. We're talking about seeing the world through a very subjective lens. The cinematographer is going to use a certain focal length, is going to use a certain depth of field with the combination of iris and focus. They're going to put filters in front of it. The position of the camera to the subject is going to tell you a lot, the way it is lit. So we have all of those visual cues. That means if the job is done well, you could watch a movie in a foreign language and not understand a single word, but by looking at it, you know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, where is the love interest, and is it a tense or a relaxed moment, just by those visual cues. So those are extremely important notions to understand from film. And I'm sure I'm not teaching you something new. You probably all have notions of that. So for example, if we look on top here, what's important is not what's happening. This is from production still from Saving Private Ryan. What is important is not the actual actors playing soldiers in the field. What is important is what Steven Spielberg looks through this very tiny viewfinder. This is the movie. This is where the magic happens. This is where the emotion, the intention, and the interpretation of what is in front of the screen takes place. So it's important for us to preserve that. Even if you're doing a wholly virtual production, this is from The Lion King last summer. They still had camera operators go through the environment, even though it was virtual, to interpret that scene the way the director wants it. So, how do we archive movies? Let's look at the past, present, and the future. So, in the past, as we have here, this is the Academy's library. Everything was filmed. From a technical standpoint, it was a relatively easier time, relatively, because it was still no piece of cake. But everything here was film. You shot on film, you developed on film, you edited on film, and so on and so forth, up to your master, and then you made distribution print still on film and put it out. So you're always staying within the same environment. As computer technology progressed, we now have more advanced technologies that allow us to go a lot further than we did before. So in the 2000s, early 2000s, we started to add the step of DI, or digital intermediate, which is very anachronistic in a lot of our modern workflows, but is still the term used. It was an intermediate, basically a step of digital between two sides of film medium. So we captured the film, then we have a scanner that will scan it at a certain bit depth with a certain color gamut, make it a digital file. We can add visual effects, and those have become good enough that we can inject them in the movie. Then everything is conformed in digital. Then we do our color grade, which is based on the projection technology or technologies of today. And then there was a film out process that would use a laser printer to bring it back to film, which could then be distributed. So we had that little intermediate phase. That's still the process that we use on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. For example, he did use the film at the origin, and I think he made a couple of screenings in film as well. But it's so convenient to be able to do all of your post-production and editorial digitally that that part was still done as a DI process. Now a lot of our modern movies are entirely digital, from a camera that's basically a sensor capturing the image, everything, VFX, editorial, conforming, everything is done in the digital realm for a digital distribution. There's not that many film projectors left, and commercially, that's been gone for quite a while. Now we have new technologies coming up that bring us new challenges. Great opportunities, but also challenges. So we've started to have some of the computing giants, Intel, I think Google, Amazon, start to develop, well, we're good in processing and crunching numbers. What can we do with that massive amount of data? And so we have now the dawn of spatial imaging. So we're kind of losing the notion of the lens and the film plane. What we're capturing is not exactly what the director sees through a viewfinder. We're capturing loads and loads of data. What we have is voxels, basically a point of light somewhere in space, and we're creating this volume at X amount of frames per second. Then you have the freedom afterwards to go and position the camera where you want and do whatever you want with it. So the most popular technologies right now for that are volumetric capture, which is an array of cameras that capture enough information with enough redundancy that you can assign precise pixel position for every single point of light in your scene. The other one being light field capture, which uses an engine behind the lens to capture multiple planes to understand where things are in space. All with the same goal, which is to create a 3D model of where light is actually in our environment. So it's not going to be too far in time ahead of us that we're going to have what I call hybrid digital and computational production. A combination of digital capture, which is still an image. Instead of a film, it's a sensor plane. But we're also going to have spatial imaging, where what you're generating, as I said, is not an image, but a series of points in space. So those will need to be interpreted. This is what I call the shot rendering process here, so that we can create that subjective viewpoint, that storyteller's viewpoint of, yes, this is fine, this is the 3D model, but this is where I want the camera to be with that scene. This is how close I want to be to the emotion. This is the amount of depth of field that I want. So you will still need that process if you're still making movies, because movies are based, like I said, on that subjective director vision. After that, then we do editing. And what I like to do is to split the traditional color grading in two steps. One which I call scene grading, and one which I call display grading. And I think it's quite important to separate the two. So I'll spend a minute just to explain why. In most cases, when we do color grading of a movie, we tend to combine multiple things, and the colorist has more and more tools. The very first color grading suites were an evolution of our film labs, and I'm not talking about film lab, I'm talking about laboratories, of course. So we could change the exposure level, the saturation, so it was mostly about light and color. But now in a colorist's arsenal is almost like a little VFX factory built into the grading environment. You can track things. You can rotoscope things out. You can remove facial blemishes. You can actually modify the ears if the actor doesn't like the way he or she looks on screen. You can do a lot of things that have nothing to do with the environment in which you display it. They're strictly optical changes. And if we decouple the decisions that we make based on an optical perception, depth of field, fixing things, from the decisions we make in color and light, which are based on the display technology that is in front of our eyes, I think we increase greatly the value of our assets in the future, because we're making a lot of subjective decisions in color grading that are strictly dependent on the display technology that's in front of us, which may be state of the art today, but may not be in a couple of years. A good example for that is traditional film restoration. So I worked at Technicolor for 5 years, and talking with the restoration folks, it was always funny because they would tell me, you know, 5 years ago, we scanned all of the film masters from the studios in 10-bit DPX. Great, now we are doing the exact same thing, going back to the exact same masters, because now they want to have a 16-bit linear. So for them, it was great, it's just more business. But the reason they could generate more business was because our film master had that much color and luminance into it that you could still scan it and get something better out of it than the thing you scanned 5 years before. So by separating the decisions we make optical from the decisions we make color and luminance allows what I call our truly digital negative, which is capturing the greatest latitude that the camera could have on your set from the subjective and destructive decisions that you will make based on the best state-of-the-art projection technology at the time that you do it. So it allows you to go back in the future, let's say we have 10 times as bright screens with greater color gamut, to retake that optical master instead of trying to trim this up, that digital burned-in version, which is kind of what we had to do at the beginning of digital high dynamic range. We took the master that was shot for digital cinema. There was a test sequence that was made in film. It was Canon 10-bit DPX, and then tried to scale it up for HDR demos, it was not as convincing as going back to the original 35mm film and scanning it at 16-bit. So I'll show you a little bit, just an example, something I shot a number of years back for an IMAX 3D movie in Hawaii, just to show the difference between an optical, what I call optical decisions, and screen-based decisions. So this is the original shot. It looks not good because the colors and the brightness are not to the screen. So I've added some virtual depth of field. So now we have an optically different image. Added a mapping of an anamorphic lens to give it more of an artistic look. So that becomes our scene grade. That we can use in the future and still look good. And now that I know which screen I'm using it on, now I'm applying proper color and luminance decisions so that it's optimal on the screen. But in 10 years from now, I can still go back to my optical master, which has a lot more color and dynamic range than this image here. So it's future-proofing your assets. So my recommendations for the scene grade, and by the way, it doesn't mean that you have to do the two operations sequentially in time. The idea is that the colorist can separate in the grade whether you're using different nodes in a node-based system or different layers in a timeline-based system, just to separate those operations so that when you hit the render button, you deactivate all of the display related to create your scene master, and then you activate everything to create your display master for today. So a recommendation for the scene grade is to use OpenEXR. You can stay in ACES, basically a beautiful system that's been made to capture every single color that a human eye can perceive and more contrast than we can handle. So this will give you as close to what was in front of the lens as the camera could capture at that time. And then multiple display grades depending on the technology of the day. For example, Netflix today would say, I want my display master to be a Dolby Vision 12-bit Rec 2020, and then from that you can derive down to the SDR Rec 709. So, question we have now is, we've generated a lot of other assets. What do we do with them? So we've generated 3D models. If we're in spatial imaging, we have tons of data. What are we going to do with all of that? I think that's a business decision. There's a certain danger in keeping all of this, which is a temptation to go and revisit your source assets so that you can make modifications to them. So then you become sort of a revisionist of the original asset. So I would tend to be careful about that. And that's opening up all of this spatial computing and all of our technologies, a whole can of worms of ethical questions that we need to ask ourselves. Is an actor's performance linked to the character that he or she is playing on the screen? If that person passes away, do we have the right to keep using his or her likeness in future versions with or without their consent while they were living? The example here of Star Trek is another valid one, and it's also in several movies. We revisit them and we add new technology, and all of a sudden something that was a model that was optically filmed is now replaced by a computer-generated scene. It looks cool, but in the other hand, it robs of credit hundreds of workers that have spent a lot of time and artistry in developing the original vision. Is that ethically right or correct to do? Should we clearly mark that a movie has been revisited and some portions are not the way they were originally? So we have a lot of ethical questions and responsibility that comes with the kind of technologies that we're developing. Here's just one little example. In 2014, a chocolate bar company made an ad featuring Audrey Hepburn, but Audrey Hepburn had been deceased for a number of years. So they asked her children for permission, and they basically built a 3D model of her and created an ad as if she was in her 20s in the early 60s. I'm not sure that's right. Can actually your descendants copyright you? Do you want, as a performer, your performance to be linked to your future performances to be done without your consent? What does that say about your legacy? What if now we're at 16 grandchildren? Who gets the right to say what should be or should not be an acceptable script for that virtual deceased actor? So it opens up a whole series of ethical issues that we need to be careful about, I think. So in conclusion for my presentation, I wanted to clarify that to me a story is a specific thing. It's subjective, it's passive. A movie is a subset of that with specific rules. Basically, it's the interpretation of the storyteller through the lens that will tell us their vision of the events unfolding in front of the camera. And so that's what we need to preserve as an intent. And I've talked about separating a screen master, which has all the color and dynamic range that was available at time of capture, from a display master that is a toned-down version to the best projection or direct display technology of the day. So that was it for my presentation. I think we're opening the floor to questions now, right?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Pierre. Can we get a round of applause? Fantastic. Now, if you have any questions, I can either walk around with the mic or there's a stand right there. And yeah, please come on up, and whether you have questions or you want to even share your thoughts about these ethical considerations. What is the goal that you see with our current technology? Do we expect them to last for 50 years, 100 years, like film might, in a vault, in the right conditions? Share your thoughts.
Good question about basically the physical medium onto which our data is going to be saved. In the days of film, you made sure that you had a dry and well-preserved environment. Hopefully, your film will survive a long time. In the case like we had a number of years back of a fire at Universal, they had backup copies, so we were safe. In a digital medium, I think we need to have, yes, backup strategies and technologies that will evolve. The idea of open ACEs is that we have, and why I prefer open ACEs versus raw assets, for example, first of all, we've graded them optically, but also it's an open source format, so we can save actual images of the systems under which we ran it at a certain time, which means that in the future I can still reaccess. So open source, multiple backup strategy, make sure for replication that you keep your digital assets active for a long time.
Great, thank you. All right, we have some questions.
Hi, I'm Anthony Magliocco. I have two questions for you. The cost of restoring motion pictures, that's always the question. Where do you see the future funding coming from?
That's the future funding of movie restoration. It's a big challenge, I would say, depending on the country where they were produced and the intent behind it. In Canada, we have certain social concerns about the posterity of what was produced with taxpayers' money. So we do have restoration and management policies at the National Film Board of Canada, for example. Where it becomes more dicey is when we're talking about production enterprises by public or private companies like the movie system in Hollywood, and their decision to keep or not, and in which condition they will keep the assets. The beauty in keeping a digital master is that it's not that expensive. The OpenEXR format is quite efficient in the way it manages file size. And archiving this is not a significant amount of money versus celluloid, which was a lot more of an issue in the past. So is your question about restoring past 35 millimeter film or restoring digital assets in the future?
Well, I've been involved in both, and of course the cost of going back to the film is always expensive, but even scanning it's not inexpensive. So the second question is lots and lots of libraries of television programs which were produced in the past are tangled up in really complicated rights. Has there been any discussion about trying to break through some of that log jam so that we can actually see some of these material?
So I'm sorry, there's a lot of echo, so I'm not hearing super well. You're talking about the rights of various things in the assets you're restoring?
Right.
Yeah, it is, once again, the product of movies not just being pieces of art, but being actual commercial enterprises for profit, where the producer, the actors, the art director, the screenwriter, everyone has their word and their say. I haven't seen any work done on clearing what you call the logjam, but that's definitely something that would need to be addressed eventually, for sure.
Thank you.
Mike Palmer with Mastech. As the technology continues to evolve, and it does so at a rapid pace, how important is not only identifying the standard that applied to something, but also the definition of the standard and the environment in which the standard was used? How important is that in the context of archiving, and does that play into the use of SMPTE's archive exchange format?
Okay, so with the question basically all being about preserving the creative intent, I think there's a bit of the idea of both in the scene and the display grade, where the scene grade captures the essence of what was in front of the camera at the greatest capture format that was available at the time. I mean, I can't invent more dynamic range in the camera than there is, or more colors, but at least I'm sure that I kept that. Having a reference display master is also like if you had, for example, a Beethoven symphony, but it's nice to have the partition, but if I have all the pages and notes that the composer wrote, then I know how to interpret it properly. And that display master provides that to us in the future to say, in the constraints they had with limited color and dynamic range, these are the decisions they made. And we can use this as a model for our future grade when we have more capability to see what they felt was important or not from a luminance and color standpoint in the picture.
Great. Just
One
real
more?
quick, one more question and answer, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
James Snyder, Library of Congress. So this is kind of in our wheelhouse, given that we have the world's largest film collection. I came in late, though, so you may have addressed this, but I wanted to at least ask the question. Did you, beyond the metadata that goes into the portions of your presentation that I saw, do you have a feel for what types of metadata beyond what we're talking about today we still need to work on, standardize, develop, and do you have a feel for things like, checksums that will allow data validation over time, especially if you know that you're retaining for a long period of time? We use them because, our minimum retention period is 150 years, which is the copyright period. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, that would be a layer underneath the 30-minute presentation that I had to give today. It's all the mechanics of taking that digital source and putting it in a forward future compatible format or formats. The parts I've been involved into include near-term storage to cold storage to tape storage, and we keep multiple copies and we check some, and every X number of years we're gonna just replace our tapes. Every number of years we're gonna replace our drives. So you need to have those kind of things in place. I think the most important thing from this presentation is to keep as much open source material as you, the material you have to keep it as much in open source formats that have as much latitude as you can to not destroy from what you captured in the camera. And one very last comment is a word of warning against keeping your master in raw formats. Raw formats are vendor specific. I don't know if Red or Ari or Sony, I'm sure they're all going to be still out there in 5 years. I don't know if they will be there in 100 years and how we're going to be able to re-access those formats. But I'm pretty confident, since it has the whole academy behind it and a number of other institutions, that OpenEXR will still be available and understood as a format and can be read. So it may be a little bit more of an issue. Certain cinematographers don't like it because we're deburring the images, but I believe that's the cinematographer's best foot forward at the time of the creation of the work of art, and this is what we should keep. And I've run over my time. I'm sorry.
Great. Thank you guys so much, and thank you, Pierre.